the corpse in the apartment building, a family's nightmare. In this chilling story, a family moves into a seemingly ordinary apartment complex only to uncover the terrifying secret of a mysterious past that still haunts the place. Mark and his wife Emma, along with their newborn, are hoping for a peaceful life after leaving their crowded family home. However, strange occurrences begin to plague their new residence: unexplained noises, the eerie presence of someone lurking, and the smell of death hanging in the air. As Mark tries to dismiss the bizarre events as mere coincidences, Emma becomes increasingly paranoid, sensing a malignant force. The tension builds until Mark makes a horrifying discovery: in the cellar beneath the apartment, a gruesome secret that explains the terrifying occurrences. The haunting spirit of a woman, once trapped and murdered, refuses to rest, tormenting anyone who dares to live in her cursed home. What started as an escape from family tensions quickly turns into a nightmarish fight for survival. Their only hope is to flee before the malevolent spirit takes another victim. Part 1. A new beginning. Mark adjusted the rearview mirror as the final boxes were loaded into their car. Emma stood nearby, their newborn son cradled in her arms, his tiny head nestled against her chest. She wore a faint smile of exhaustion, her face etched with the weariness of motherhood. But there was something else in her expression: hope for a fresh start, away from the suffocating life they'd been living. Mark gave her a reassuring look, masking his own fatigue and uncertainty. "This is it," Baby said, forcing a smile. "Our new home." Finally, Emma nodded, her gaze drifting towards the old apartment building. It was nothing grand, just an affordable place on the outskirts of town, but it was theirs. After months of living cramped in the chaos of their extended family's home, the thought of finally having their own space was like a breath of fresh air. The small apartment had come at the right price, almost suspiciously affordable, but Mark had chalked it up to luck. They needed this. Emma needed this. As they drove closer to their new apartment, the bustling city sounds faded into the distance, replaced by the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of wind through the trees. The area seemed peaceful enough, quiet and removed from the busyness of downtown. When they arrived at the apartment complex, Emma could see the rows of identical, weathered buildings stretching in both directions. The place wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and quiet, exactly what they had been looking for. "This could be good," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Mark parked the car, and as they stepped out onto the sidewalk, a slight chill passed through the air, making Emma shiver. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself and glanced at the apartment building again. There was something about it, she couldn't quite put her finger on, something that made her stomach twist. It wasn't the dilapidated exterior, the cracked windows, or the cheap paint. It was the atmosphere. The way the air felt heavier here, thicker somehow, like the building itself was holding its breath. Still, she brushed the feeling aside. They were tired, and maybe her mind was playing tricks on her after the stress of the move. She forced a smile and turned towards Mark. He was already unloading boxes, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. If he was feeling uneasy, he didn't show it. The apartment was on the second floor, and as they made their way up the creaky staircase, Emma caught a glimpse of their new neighbors. A few elderly residents shuffled past, offering polite nods but nothing more. The building had an eerie quietness to it, as if sound itself avoided the hallways. Even their footsteps seemed too loud against the worn floorboards. But when they unlocked the door to their apartment, the sight of their new home gave Emma a glimmer of comfort. It was small but cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The kitchen was modest, the living room furnished with outdated carpet, and the walls were a drab shade of beige, but it was theirs. Emma carefully placed the baby in his crib in the corner of the bedroom, the little one's face serene in sleep. She ran her fingers gently across his cheek, smiling softly. Mark began setting up their things, and soon enough, the apartment began to feel more like a home. They hung up pictures, arranged the furniture, and unpacked the last of the moving boxes. "See," Mark said, flopping down onto the couch. "Not too bad," Emma nodded. "Yeah, not bad at all, but as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the apartment, that unsettling feeling returned. Emma couldn't shake it. There was something about the way the light dimmed in the corners of the room, how the silence felt almost oppressive. It was as if the apartment was waiting, watching. She turned on a few lamps, trying to chase away the shadows, but it did little to ease her unease. "I'm going to take a quick walk around the complex," Mark said, stretching his arms above his head, "just to get a feel for the place." "You gonna be alright?" Emma hesitated, glancing at the sleeping baby, then back at him. "Yeah, we'll be fine. Just don't be too long," Mark smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Won't be. I'll just do a quick loop and be back before you know it." As the door clicked shut behind him, Emma sat alone in the apartment, the baby's soft breathing the only sound. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ignore the crawling sensation on the back of her neck. It was irrational, she told herself. It was a new place, unfamiliar. It was normal to feel a little strange. But no matter how hard she tried, the feeling wouldn't leave. Suddenly, there was a soft creak from the hallway. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she glanced toward the door. She listened intently, but the apartment was still, no more sounds. Just her imagination. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the thudding of her heart. The baby stirred, making a small noise before settling back into sleep. Emma glanced at him, relieved that he hadn't fully woken up. As she stood to check on the baby, her eyes caught something strange in the corner of the room. There was a small dark stain on the wall, something she hadn't noticed earlier. Frowning, she walked closer. The stain was almost black, jagged around the edges, like old water damage. But it wasn't wet. It was dry, cracked, as if it had been there for years. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the rough surface. A shiver ran down her spine. Emma quickly pulled her hand back, staring at the stain. It was just an old mark on the wall, she told herself. Nothing more. And yet, the way it seemed to pulse in the dim light made her feel as if something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Before she could think more about it, the door swung open and Mark stepped in, shaking off the evening chill. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes flicking to her paler face. "Yeah, I think so," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "Just getting used to the place," I guess. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, it seems quiet around here. Saw a couple of neighbors, but nothing much. Kinda like we're the only ones living here." Emma nodded absently, her thoughts still lingering on the strange stain. "Yeah, quiet." That night, after putting the baby to sleep, they both climbed into bed, the day's exhaustion finally catching up to them. Mark fell asleep almost immediately, but Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the building, every sigh of the wind seemed amplified in the silence of the night. She rolled over, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she began to drift off, there was a noise. A soft, distant whisper. Her eyes snapped open, her breath catching in her throat. She strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came. Emma told herself it was nothing. The wind, perhaps, or the old pipes. She repeated those thoughts in her mind like a mantra, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in this apartment. And as the shadows danced in the corners of the room, Emma could have sworn she saw something move, a flicker of darkness, barely there but undeniably real. Part 2. The Whispering. The first night in the new apartment, Emma lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling. She couldn't explain it, but something felt off. Mark was snoring gently beside her. Their newborn son was peacefully asleep in his crib, and yet Emma's skin prickled with an inexplicable sense of unease. She put the blanket up to her chin, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow lurking just out of sight. It was well past midnight when she first heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it barely registered. Her heart skipped a beat as she strained to listen. The sound was coming from the kitchen. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't the hum of the refrigerator, nor the usual creaks of an old building settling. No, this was different. It was a voice. But the words were too faint, too garbled to make out. Her mind raced. Was someone in the apartment? The thought made her blood run cold. Slowly she sat up in bed, careful not to wake Mark. Her eyes darted to the bedroom door, left slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of darkness to seep through from the hallway. The whispering continued, soft but persistent. Emma's pulse quickened, and every instinct screamed at her to stay in bed, to hide under the covers like a child afraid of the monsters lurking beneath the bed. But this wasn't the fear of childhood nightmares. This felt real. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. As she moved cautiously toward the door, the whispering stopped. Just like that, the apartment was silent again, as though the sound had never been there in the first place. Emma stood in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest, listening intently for any other noise. Nothing. Only the soft ticking of the wall clock and the steady rhythm of Mark's breathing behind her. She exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the better of her. Maybe it was just the old pipes after all, she told herself. She had heard that old buildings could make all sorts of strange noises at night. That had to be it. Still, as she climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket around herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. The next morning, Emma didn't mention the incident to Mark. What was there to say, really? That she had heard whispers in the dead of night? He would probably laugh and tell her she was overthinking things. And maybe he'd be right. After all, they were still getting used to the new place. The stress of moving, coupled with the exhaustion of caring for a newborn, was bound to mess with her nerves. But that afternoon, while Mark was at work, it happened again. Emma was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes when the whispering returned. This time it was more distinct, like someone was standing just behind her, murmuring in a low voice. She froze, her hands submerged in the soapy water. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. It's just the pipe, she told herself again. It has to be. But her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned her head to look behind her. The kitchen was empty. She was alone. And yet, the whispering persisted, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from the walls, the very structure of the apartment itself. Emma took a step back, her pulse racing. The voice wasn't clear enough to understand, but it felt angry, urgent. She rushed out of the kitchen, her mind buzzing with fear and confusion. The whispering stopped the moment she crossed the threshold into the living room. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She looked around the apartment, half expecting to see someone lurking in the corners, but there was no one. Clutching her phone, she debated calling Mark. But what would she say? That the apartment was whispering to her? It sounded absurd, even in her own head. Instead, she sat down on the couch, taking slow, deep breaths to calm herself. It's nothing, she thought. You're just tired. You haven't slept properly in weeks. But despite her attempts to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong with the apartment. That night, when Mark came home, she tried to bring it up casually. Have you heard any strange noises in the apartment, she asked, keeping her tone light. Mark, in the middle of setting the table for dinner, glanced up at her with a raised eyebrow. Strange noises? Like what? Emma hesitated. I don't know. Whispering, I guess. Or maybe it's just the pipes. It's probably nothing, Mark chuckled. Pipes can make all sorts of weird sounds in old buildings. I wouldn't worry about it. His dismissive tone stung, but Emma forced a smile. Yeah, you're probably right, but later that night, as they lay in bed, Emma couldn't sleep. The whispering had unsettled her far more than she let on. She tossed and turned, listening for any hint of noise, any sign that the voice might return. Hours passed in tense silence, and eventually exhaustion overtook her, pulling her into a restless sleep. Then came the scratching. It started softly, like the sound of something brushing against the wall. At first, Emma thought it might be a tree branch scraping against the side of the building, but when she opened her eyes and listened more closely, the sound was too deliberate, too precise. It was coming from inside the wall, right behind the headboard of their bed. Her breath caught in her throat as the scratching grew louder, more frantic, like nails dragging across the surface of the wall. She could hear it sharp and persistent, like an animal trying to claw its way out from behind the plaster. She nudged Mark, her voice a shaky whisper. "Do you hear that?" Mark groaned, barely conscious. "What that sound?" It's coming from the wall." Mark blinked himself awake, frowning as he listened. The scratching was unmistakable now, louder and more aggressive. He sat up in bed, his face creased with confusion. "What the hell?" Emma clutched the blanket tighter around herself, her heart hammering in her chest. "What is it?" Mark swung his legs out of bed and stood up, moving cautiously toward the wall. He pressed his ear against the plaster, listening intently. The scratching continued, relentless and unnerving. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice tense. Maybe there's something in the walls. A rat or something." Emma's stomach twisted at the thought. "A rat?" Mark shrugged, clearly trying to downplay his own unease. "Could be. These old buildings can have all sorts of pests." But Emma wasn't convinced. The sound was too strange, too deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal, it sounded like something trying to get out. Mark grabbed his phone and used the flashlight to inspect the wall, running his hand along the surface. There was nothing visibly wrong, no cracks or holes. But the scratching continued, persistent and eerie. "We'll call someone tomorrow," Mark said, his voice strained. "Maybe a pest control guy." He climbed back into bed, but neither of them slept well that night. The scratching persisted for hours, only stopping when the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains. Over the next few days, the strange noises continued, growing louder and more unsettling. The whispering returned every time Emma was alone in the apartment, and the scratching behind the wall became more frequent, almost as if something was deliberately tormenting them. Mark tried to ignore it, brushing off Emma's concerns with reassurances that it was just an old building with creaky pipes and maybe a wooden problem. But Emma could see the tension in his eyes, the way he flinched at every unexplained noise. One evening, while they were sitting in the living room, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Emma looked up, her heart racing. The baby was asleep in the bedroom, and the door was locked. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just outside the apartment. Mark stood up, his jaw clenched. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the shelf. He moved toward the door, every step careful and quiet. Emma watched, her breath shallow, as he peered through the peephole. "There's no one out there," Mark said after a moment, his voice tight with frustration. "But I heard it," Emma insisted, her voice trembling. "There were footsteps. I swear I heard them." Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn between disbelief and the growing sense that something wasn't right. He opened the door, shining the flashlight into the hallway. The long corridor was empty, dimly lit by the single flickering light overhead. There were no signs of movement, no sounds of anyone retreating. But Emma knew what she had heard. Mark closed the door and locked it, his expression grim. "We'll talk to the landlord tomorrow," he said, his voice firm. "Maybe there's something going on in the building that we don't know about, but deep down." Emma felt that whatever was happening in their apartment had nothing to do with the building itself. Something was wrong, something far more sinister than they could explain. As they went to bed that night, the atmosphere in the apartment felt heavier, more oppressive. The whispering returned just as Emma was drifting off to sleep, and this time she was sure she heard her name. It wasn't the pipes, it wasn't the walls. Something was in the apartment with them. Part 3. Mysterious Movements. The first sign that something was truly wrong came not in the dead of night, but in the soft morning light, an hour when the world is supposed to feel safe. Emma was cradling their son in her arms, his small, warm body pressed against her chest as she hummed softly to calm him. He had been restless, waking up every few hours with piercing cries that echoed through the silent apartment. No matter how much she soothed him, his tiny body trembled as if he had seen something no baby should ever see. It was the third morning in a row that the baby had woken up like this, screaming in terror for reasons Emma couldn't understand. She hadn't slept properly in days, her nerves frayed from the constant strain of listening to the baby's cries, the strange noises, and the oppressive weight of something unseen lurking just beyond the edge of her perception. Mark was already gone for work, leaving her alone in the apartment with the child. She tried to focus on the simple rhythm of her movements rocking gently back and forth, humming the lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. But the apartment was too quiet, too still. The air felt thick and stagnant, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. And then she heard a soft, subtle creak from the hallway. Emma tensed, her body instinctively tightening around the baby. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. The apartment was empty as far as she could see, but the silence pressed in around her, a suffocating blanket of unease that made her skin crawl. Her gaze shifted to the front door, where two small decorative stone dogs sat on either side, sentinels of sorts. She'd found them charming when they first moved in, a quirky addition left by the previous tenants. Now, they looked out of place, their faces frozen in blank stares. But something was off. The dogs had shifted just slightly, but enough for Emma to notice. She knew she hadn't touched them, neither had Mark. She always left them in the same position, their stone bodies facing forward. But now one was slightly turned, angled just enough that its eyes seemed to be watching her. Her breath hitched, and she swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot of fear twisting in her gut. Maybe she had knocked into it without realizing. Maybe Mark had bumped it on his way out the door and hadn't noticed. That was logical, wasn't it? But as much as she tried to reason with herself, the unease wouldn't leave. For the rest of the day, Emma moved through the apartment like a shadow, her footsteps quiet, her senses heightened. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the old building seemed magnified, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. By the time evening fell, she was on edge, her nerves stretched thin. Mark came home, tired from a long day, but he could see the tension etched into Emma's face. "You okay?" he asked, setting his keys down on the kitchen counter. Emma hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the hallway where the stone dogs still sat, their positions unchanged since the morning. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's off." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, unsure how to explain. The whispering, the creaks, the baby's uncontrollable crying, the stone dogs. It all sounded absurd when spoken out loud, but she knew what she had seen, what she had felt. "I don't think we're alone here," she said finally, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, it's an old building. You know how these places are. The walls creak, the floor settle. And the baby, he's probably just adjusting to the new environment." "I know," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "But it's not just that. Things are moving, Mark. Things that shouldn't be." Mark raised an eyebrow. Moving, Emma pointed toward the hallway. "The stone dogs. They're not where I left them." Mark glanced toward the front door, then back at Emma. "Maybe one of us bumped into them without realizing. I'm sure there's an explanation," but Emma wasn't convinced. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he was brushing off her concerns. He didn't want to believe that something was wrong, and she couldn't blame him. She didn't want to believe it either. That night, the baby screamed again, waking them both in the dead of night. Emma shot up in bed, her heart racing as the piercing cries filled the apartment. Mark groaned beside her, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "I'll get him," Emma said, her voice tight with exhaustion. She climbed out of bed and crossed the room to the crib, where their son lay writhing, his tiny fists clenched, his face red and tear-streaked. His cries were so loud, so filled with terror, that Emma's heart ached just hearing them. She scooped him up, holding him close, whispering soothing words into his ear. But no matter how much she rocked him, he wouldn't calm down. Mark joined her, his face pale in the dim light. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, his voice edged with concern. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "He's been like this for days." Mark reached out, gently stroking the baby's back, but the crying didn't stop. It was as if the child was seeing something they couldn't, something horrifying enough to make him scream until his voice cracked. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could explain the baby's distress, and then she saw it. The closet door. It was open. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was sure, absolutely sure, that she had closed it before going to bed. She always closed it just as a habit. But now, the door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness creeping out from the space between the door and the frame. Her stomach churned with dread. Slowly she stepped toward the closet, her feet dragging as if weighed down by invisible chains. The baby's cries grew louder, more frantic, as if sensing what she was about to do. Mark watched her, his brow furrowed, but he didn't say anything. With a trembling hand, Emma reached out and pushed the door open. The closet was empty. Of course it was empty. But the air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the room, and the smell. There was a smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sickly sweet odor of decay, like something rotting just beneath the surface. Emma recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. She slammed the closet door shut and backed away, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't normal. This wasn't just the quirks of an old building. Something was in their apartment. Something dark, something angry. The next day, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the closet, about the baby's screams, about the stone dogs. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, like the apartment was slowly unraveling her mind. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. She didn't feel safe, not in her own home, not even in broad daylight. She spent most of the day on edge, jumping at the slightest noise. When the baby finally went down for a nap, she collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, but her rest was short-lived. It started with a faint clatter, like something being knocked over in the kitchen. Emma sat up, her heart racing. She listened intently, waiting for the noise to happen again. Silence. Slowly she stood and made her way to the kitchen, her footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. When she entered the room, she froze. The chairs. They had moved. All 4 chairs around the dining table were now pulled out, as if someone or something had just been sitting there. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the scene before her. She hadn't touched the chairs. No one had. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She backed out of the kitchen, her eyes wide with fear. She wanted to call Mark to tell him what was happening, but she knew he wouldn't believe her. He would tell her that she was imagining things, that she was tired, that the baby's cries were wearing her down, and maybe he'd be right. But as she turned to leave the kitchen, something caught her eye. The cupboard door under the sink was open, just a crack. Emma stared at it, her pulse quickening. She hadn't opened that door. She hadn't been near it all day. With trembling hands, she reached out and pulled the cupboard open. The air inside was cold, so cold that it made her breath catch. There was nothing inside except for a few cleaning supplies, but the coldness lingered, pressing against her skin like icy fingers. Emma slammed the cupboard shut and backed away, her heart racing. She couldn't stay here, not alone. When Mark came home that evening, Emma was waiting for him by the door, her face pale and drawn. "Something's wrong with this place," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to leave." Mark frowned, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean? What happened to baby?" Emma whispered, clutching their son tightly in her arms. "He's been crying non-stop, Mark, and things are moving. The chairs, the cupboard, everything. It's like the apartment is alive." Mark rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. "Emma, you're exhausted? You haven't slept in days? Of course, things are going to seem strange when you're this tired," but Emma shook her head. "No, it's not just me. There's something here. Something that doesn't want us here." Mark sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Okay, I'll check the apartment. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for all of this." But as he walked through the apartment, inspecting each room, he could feel it too, the oppressive weight of something unseen, something lurking just beyond the reach of his senses. The air was thick, suffocating, and every shadow seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. When he returned to the living room, his face was pale, his expression troubled. "Maybe we should stay somewhere else tonight," he muttered, avoiding Emma's gaze. Emma didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew that something had changed in the apartment, something they couldn't explain, but could no longer ignore. As they packed a bag and prepared to leave, Emma glanced once more at the stone dogs by the front door. They had moved again, and this time they were both facing directly at her. That night, as they left the apartment and drove away into the dark, neither of them spoke. But the baby, for the first time in days, slept soundly in his car seat, as if the presence that had tormented him had been left behind, for now. Part 4. The Woman in the Hall. The evening began like any other. Emma was in the living room, rocking their baby in the soft glow of a dim lamp, trying to lull him to sleep after another restless day. Mark stood on a wobbly step stool in the hallway, attempting to fix the flickering light bulb that had been bothering them for days. He had procrastinated for as long as possible, but tonight the constant flicker was too much. It cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to twitch and shift, almost alive. The apartment was quiet, eerily so, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but he brushed it aside. The last few weeks had been stressful for both of them. The baby's constant crying, the strange sounds, Emma's increasing paranoia, it was all taking its toll. He knew Emma was fragile, on edge, so when things started feeling off, he dismissed them as tricks of the mind, a result of exhaustion and too many sleepless nights. But the night felt different. The hallway seemed darker than usual, the air heavier. As Mark screwed in the new light bulb, the flickering stopped for a moment, and everything stilled. He exhaled a quiet sigh of relief, stepping down from the stool and looking down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the bedroom. That's when he saw her. At first it didn't register. His brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. But there she was, standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside the bedroom door, a woman, a figure cloaked in a tattered, filthy gown, her dark hair hanging in stringy clumps around her face. She was deathly still, her body unnaturally stiff, and her head tilted at a grotesque angle, as if her neck had been snapped in some violent act. Mark's heart seized in his chest. For a brief moment he couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. His body locked in place as cold fear washed over him, paralyzing him. The woman stood there, her face obscured by her matted hair, but he could feel her eyes on him, burning through the strands like two lifeless orbs. The hallway seemed to stretch, the distance between them going impossibly long, as if time itself had bent around her, trapping them in this moment of terror. A suffocating silence hung between them, thick and oppressive. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the pounding of his heart as it hammered against his ribs, but no sound escaped his lips. For an instant, Mark's mind screamed at him to run, to get as far away from her as possible. But his feet were frozen to the floor, his hands gripping the edges of the step stool with white-knuckled intensity. His gaze locked on the woman's figure, and for what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. It was as if she had never been there at all. One blink, and the hallway was empty again. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the soft, distant hum of the city beyond their windows. The light overhead flickered once more, and Mark staggered backward, gasping for breath as if he had been holding it the entire time. He stumbled against the wall, his legs weak, his heart still pounding erratically. His entire body trembled, cold sweat slicking his skin. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the spot where she had been, his mind spinning in disbelief. What had he just seen? Had it been real? Or was it a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on his overtired brain? No, it had been real. He knew it deep in his bones. The woman had been there, standing at the end of the hallway, watching him. Mark wiped a shaky hand across his forehead, trying to steady himself. He couldn't tell Emma, not about this. She was already on edge, already terrified by the strange occurrences in the apartment. If he told her what he had seen, it would push her over the edge. She'd never feel safe here again. And besides, what could he even say? That he had seen a ghost. Ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be. There had to be a logical explanation. But as Mark stood there, staring at the empty hallway, he couldn't think of one. He forced himself to breathe to calm down. Slowly, he climbed off the stool, his legs still unsteady beneath him. He didn't glance back at the hallway as he made his way to the living room, where Emma sat in the rocking chair, humming softly to their baby. She looked up at him, her face lined with exhaustion, but there was a soft smile on her lips. "Did you fix the light?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost fragile. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it should be fine now." But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. He glanced around the living room, his eyes darting to the shadows lurking in the corners. Everything felt wrong. The air was too cold, the silence too loud. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still there, watching them, lurking just out of sight. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, frowning slightly at the look on his face. "Yeah," Mark lied, clearing his throat. "Just tired." Emma studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. She knew him too well to be fooled by his attempt at nonchalance. But she didn't press. She was too tired to push him tonight, too worn out from the endless sleepless nights with the baby. Mark sat down beside her, trying to act normal, but his mind was still racing. His hand shook as he reached out to take the baby from her, his fingers cold and clammy. The baby stirred in his arms, but he didn't cry. Not tonight. Tonight the baby was quiet, his tiny face peaceful, as if he hadn't been screaming for days on end. Mark tried to take comfort in the silence, but it only made the tension worse. The apartment felt too still, too empty. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded distant, like it was coming from another world entirely. His gaze flicked back to the hallway where the woman had stood. The memory of her ghostly figure sent a fresh wave of cold dread coursing through his veins. Her gown, filthy and torn, had hung loosely around her skeletal frame. And that head, the way it had tilted, as if she had been broken. He could still see her, standing there, her hair matted and limp, concealing her face like a veil of death. He wanted to tell Emma. He wanted to tell her everything about the woman, about the strange things that had been happening, about the suffocating sense of dread that had been growing in the apartment. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he tell her without sounding insane? Instead, he stayed silent, his arms tightening around the baby, as if he could shield him from whatever lurked in the darkness. He forced himself to smile, to pretend that everything was fine, but inside, the terror gnawed at him, clawing at his sanity. The days passed in a haze of unease, and Mark couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the hallway. Every time he walked past the spot where she had stood, his skin prickled with the memory of her presence. He avoided the hallway at night, refusing to let his eyes linger too long on the shadows that seemed to gather there, but the image of her remained burned into his mind. Emma noticed the change in him, but she didn't ask. She was too wrapped up in her own fears, her own struggles to understand the strange happenings in the apartment. The baby continued to wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and Emma's face grew more gaunt with each passing day. One night, as they lay in bed, Emma spoke, her voice trembling in the darkness. "Do you ever feel like we're not alone here?" Mark's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Emma whispered. "Sometimes it feels like someone's watching us. Like there's something here in the apartment." Mark stared up at the ceiling, his chest tight with the weight of his secret. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to tell her about the woman, about the way her lifeless eyes had seemed to bore into him, but he couldn't. He couldn't risk scaring Emma even more. She was already teetering on the edge, and the last thing she needed was to hear about ghosts. "It's just the stress," Mark said, forcing calm into his voice. "We're both tired, and this place is old. Old buildings make weird noises." Emma didn't respond. She lay there in silence, her body tense beside him. Mark knew she didn't believe him, just as he didn't believe his own words. But what else could they do? They couldn't leave. Not yet. They didn't have anywhere else to go. The apartment had become a prison, trapping them in a cycle of fear and doubt. Every night the walls seemed to close in around them, and the shadows grew longer, darker, more menacing. The woman hadn't appeared again, but Mark felt her presence everywhere. In every dark corner, in every creak of the floor, in the cold drafts that seemed to seep through the walls. He didn't know what she wanted. He didn't know why she had shown herself to him, but he feared it was only the beginning. The apartment was alive with something dark, something malevolent, and Mark knew deep down that they couldn't escape it. Weeks later, the tension in the apartment had reached a breaking point. Emma had grown quieter, more withdrawn, her once bright eyes now hollow with fear. The baby's cries echoed through the halls each night, his tiny body trembling in Emma's arms, as if he could sense the darkness that surrounded them. Mark knew he couldn't keep the secret any longer. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the baby finally asleep in his crib, Mark turned to Emma, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with dread. "What is it?" Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I saw something a few weeks ago, in the hallway." A woman. Emma's face went pale, her hands trembling. "A woman?" Mark nodded, his voice hoarse. "She was standing at the end of the hallway, dressed in a gown. She looked dead." Emma's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to scare you," Mark said, his voice cracking. "But I've been seeing her, Emma. I think she's still here." Emma didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her fear mirrored in his own eyes. Part 5. A smell of death. The first hint of the smell came late one night, just as the apartment was draped in the thick stillness that settles when the world outside sleeps. Emma had been rocking their baby in the nursery, trying desperately to soothe his restless cries, when the odor crept in like a poisonous fog, faint but unmistakable. She paused mid-rock, her heart quickening as the scent, putrid and vile, seeped into the room, curling into her nostrils and bringing with it a sudden wave of nausea. It was unlike anything she had smelled before. Not the common musty dampness of an old building, not the lingering scent of spoiled food or forgotten trash. This was different, raw, organic, and oppressive. It smelled like death. Emma froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. The baby whimpered in her arms, his tiny fists clenching the fabric of her shirt. But Emma's mind was racing, her body paralyzed by the stench. The room, which had felt claustrophobic for weeks, now seemed to tighten around her, the very air thickening with rot. The smell was strongest in the kitchen. She could feel it, like an invisible force tugging at her, urging her to step outside the nursery and find its source. But every instinct screamed for her to stay put, to keep the baby in her arms and lock herself in the nursery until the suffocating odor passed. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps something had died in the walls, some unfortunate rodent trapped behind the dry wall, but deep down she knew that wasn't the answer. The baby let out another sharp cry, his voice trembling with fear. Emma swallowed hard, fighting the rising bile in her throat, and forced herself to stand. Whatever was causing the smell, it wasn't going away. She had to do something. With the baby cradled against her chest, she tiptoed toward the door, her feet barely making a sound against the cold wooden floor. The stench grew stronger with every step until it was so overpowering that she gagged, her stomach twisting in violent knots. By the time she reached the kitchen doorway, the smell was unbearable. It clung to her like a second skin, as if the very walls were breathing rot into the air. She flicked on the light, squinting against the sudden brightness, and scanned the room. Everything appeared normal. The countertops were clean, the sink empty, the trash can closed and unremarkable. But the smell, it was everywhere. It filled her lungs, coated her tongue, and made her feel as if she were drowning in filth. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the stench. The baby squirmed in her arms, his cries growing more desperate, more frantic. She wanted to flee, to rush back to the safety of the nursery and shut the door on whatever nightmare was creeping into their home, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Then she saw it. At first it was just a trick of the light, something dark, a shadow cast by the overhead bulb. But as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a stain, a slick, wet mark spreading across the kitchen floor, dark and viscous like oil. It pooled beneath the refrigerator, thick and foul, and as Emma stared at it, the smell intensified, overwhelming her senses. Her breath came in shallow gasps, panic bubbling in her chest. There was no reason for this, no logical explanation. The floor had been cleaned just hours ago, and now it was covered in this grotesque substance that seemed to ooze from nowhere. She wanted to scream for Mark to call him to the kitchen and show him what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, her voice stolen by the sheer horror of the scene before her. Just then she heard a sound, a low, almost imperceptible noise coming from behind her. It was a whisper, faint and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. Emma whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. The kitchen was empty. There was no one there. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was a voice speaking words she couldn't understand, words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The baby screamed, his tiny body rigid with terror, and Emma's paralysis broke. She bolted from the kitchen, clutching her son to her chest, and ran back to the nursery. She slammed the door behind her, her breath coming in ragged sobs as she backed into the corner, her body trembling with fear. The whispering followed her, seeping through the walls like the smell of rot, filling the room with its maddening presence. She didn't know how long she stood there, shaking in the corner with the baby in her arms, before Mark found her. Mark had noticed the smell earlier that day, though it hadn't been nearly as strong. He had been fixing the creaky cabinet door in the hallway, trying to ignore the tension that had settled between him and Emma over the past few weeks. The baby's constant crying, the strange occurrences in the apartment, and the sleepless nights had frayed both of their nerves, and their conversations had grown short, clipped. They were both exhausted, both worn thin by the oppressive weight of whatever was haunting their home. But the smell, it had been faint then, just a hint of something foul lingering in the air. He had dismissed it as his imagination, or perhaps an old food item left too long in the fridge. But when he returned home that evening and found Emma pale and trembling in the nursery, her eyes wild with fear, he knew something was very wrong. She didn't speak at first, just clutched the baby to her chest, her knuckles white as she stared at him with wide, panicked eyes. "Emma, what happened?" Mark asked, his voice tight with worry. She shook her head, her lips trembling, but no words came out. Mark's stomach twisted with dread as he glanced around the room. Everything looked normal, but the tension in the air was palpable. He clung to them like the smell of rot, thick and suffocating. Emma finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "The kitchen. It's in the kitchen." Mark's brow furrowed. "What's in the kitchen?" But Emma only shook her head again, her eyes filling with tears. "The smell. It's worse. And there's something in there, Mark." His pulse quickened, and a cold knot of fear settled in his gut. He had tried to ignore the strange happenings in the apartment, tried to convince himself that it was all in their heads, that it was just the stress of adjusting to life with a new baby. But now, standing there in the nursery with Emma trembling before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. "I'll check it out," Mark said, his voice steady despite the growing unease gnawing at him. "Stay here." Emma didn't protest, didn't try to stop him. She just nodded, her face pale as she held the baby close. Mark left the nursery and made his way to the kitchen, his heart hammering in his chest. As he stepped into the hallway, the smell hit him with full force. It was no longer faint, it was overwhelming, rancid, as if something had died and was slowly decaying in the walls. He reached the kitchen door and hesitated for a moment, the stench making his stomach churn. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and strained, as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell was unbearable, thick and nauseating. It filled the kitchen like a living thing, curling around him, invading his lungs. Mark gagged, pressing a hand to his mouth as he scanned the room. Everything looked normal: the countertops, the sink, the fridge, but the odor was suffocating, inescapable. Then he saw it, the dark stain on the floor, slick and gleaming beneath the overhead light. It spread out from beneath the refrigerator, black and oily, like blood that had been left to fester. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he stared at it, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. He stepped closer, his shoes sticking to the floor as the smell of rot grew stronger. The stain seemed to pulse, like something alive, and for a moment Mark thought he saw movement, something writhing beneath the surface, like maggots feeding on a corpse. The bile rose in his throat, and he stumbled back, his mind spinning with horror. He couldn't explain this. There was no rational explanation for what was happening. He wanted to call out to Emma, to tell her to grab the baby and leave the apartment, but his voice was trapped in his throat. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something flickering in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. Mark's heart raced as he turned his head, and there, standing at the far end of the kitchen, was the woman. The same woman he had seen in the hallway weeks ago, her filthy gown hanging loosely from her emaciated frame, her head tilted at that unnatural angle. She was closer now, her face partially visible through the tangled mess of her hair. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him, her lifeless eyes following his every step. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from her, but his body wouldn't respond. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the stench of death surrounded him, thick and suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. The kitchen was empty again, save for the dark stain spreading across the floor and the suffocating smell of rot. Mark stood there for what felt like an eternity, his body trembling, his mind spinning. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever was haunting their apartment wasn't done with them. Over the next few days, the smell became a constant presence in their home, clinging to everything like a malevolent spirit. No matter how much they cleaned, no matter how many candles they lit, the stench of death remained. It permeated their clothes, their furniture, their very skin, until it felt like they were living inside a rotting corpse. Mark tried to dismiss it, tried to tell himself that it was just the apartment, that something had died in the walls or beneath the floorboards. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The smell wasn't just a physical presence, it was something far darker, something that was creeping into their lives and poisoning everything it touched. The tension between him and Emma grew with each passing day. They were both exhausted, both terrified, but neither of them wanted to admit it. They tiptoed around each other, their conversations short and strained, their movements careful and deliberate, as if they were afraid that any wrong step would set off the darkness that lingered in the air. The baby continued to cry at night, his wails filled with a terror that neither of them could soothe. And every night the smell grew stronger, the air thicker with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. Mark knew they couldn't stay in the apartment much longer. But as he lay awake at night, listening to the baby's cries and the whispers that seemed to crawl through the walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wouldn't be enough. Whatever was haunting them, whatever had sunk its claws into their lives, wasn't going to let them go. Part 6. Emma's Nightmares. The first nightmare came in the middle of the night, crashing into Emma's fragile sleep like a predator. One moment she was lying in the safety of her bed, curled up next to Mark, listening to the soft whimpering of their baby through the monitor. The next she was plunged into a world of shadows, dark, suffocating, and endless. She found herself standing in a long, narrow corridor, the walls pressing in on her from both sides. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of rot, the same sickening stench that had begun to creep through the apartment. She could feel it clinging to her skin, sticky and damp, as though the very atmosphere was decaying around her. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, its distant end swallowed by darkness. Emma's pulse quickened. She didn't know how she had gotten here or where she was, but every instinct screamed at her to run. The corridor was not a safe place, it was a trap, a labyrinth of fear designed to ensnare her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the darkness pressing down on her, and she turned, desperate to find a way out. But as she turned, she saw her, the woman, standing at the far end of the corridor, just barely visible in the dim light, her body draped in a tattered gown that clung to her frail, skeletal frame. Her hair hung in tangled strands, obscuring most of her face, but what Emma could see was enough to send a chill of pure terror through her. The woman's face was twisted, warped in ways that no human face should ever be. Her skin was stretched too tight, her jaw twisted into an unnatural grin that didn't reach her hollow, dead eyes. One side of her face seemed to sag as though it had melted, her flesh drooping in grotesque folds. And those eyes, those empty, soulless eyes bore into Emma with a malevolence that stole a breath from her lungs. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. The woman didn't move at first. She just stood there staring, her head tilted at an odd angle, as if she was studying Emma. Then, without warning, she took a step forward, and another. Each step was slow, deliberate, but filled with an awful certainty, like the slow crawl of death itself. The woman's twisted grin widened, her teeth yellow and jagged, her breath coming in low, raspy gasps that echoed in the corridor like whispers of doom. Emma's legs locked in place. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though the air had turned solid, trapping her in place. All she could do was watch as the woman crept closer, her steps growing louder, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she were being pulled forward by some invisible force. Finally, Emma's paralysis broke. She spun around and bolted down the corridor, her heart slamming against her ribs. The hallway twisted and turned, its walls narrowing with each step, but no matter how fast Emma ran, the woman's footsteps echoed behind her, steady and relentless. The scent of death followed her, growing stronger with each second, seeping into her very pores. Emma didn't dare look back. She could feel the woman's presence closing in, could hear her ragged breathing growing louder, closer. The walls of the corridor seemed to shift and pulse, as though they were alive, trapping her in an endless maze. Then she stumbled. Her foot caught on something, a crack in the floor or perhaps the very air itself, and she fell hard, her hands scraping against the rough ground. She gasped in pain, but forced herself to scramble forward, her fingers digging into the cold, damp floor as she tried to pull herself away from the pursuing horror. But it was too late. The woman was upon her. Emma could feel the icy fingers wrapping around her ankle, cold and skeletal, pulling her back into the darkness. She screamed, kicking out wildly, but the woman's grip was unbreakable. Emma twisted around, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the woman's face hovering just inches from hers. That grotesque, twisted smile stretched impossibly wide, her eyes gleaming with malice. The woman opened her mouth, and Emma could smell the decay on her breath, feel the cold water of death seeping into her very soul. The woman leaned in closer, her face splitting into a grin so wide it threatened to tear her skin apart. "Run, little girl," the woman whispered, her voice like the creaking of old wood. "You can't escape." Emma screamed, the sound tearing from her throat in a primal wail of terror, and she woke. Emma bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her chest, her body slick with sweat. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The shadows of the bedroom seemed to twist and dance around her, and she half expected to see the woman standing at the foot of the bed, that twisted grin still etched into her face, but the room was empty. Quiet, save for the soft hum of the baby monitor and Mark's slow, steady breathing beside her. She forced herself to take deep, ragged breaths, her chest heaving as she tried to calm the frantic beat of her heart. Just a dream. It was just a dream. But even as she told herself that, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. The smell of death still seemed to hang in the air, faint but unmistakable, and her skin prickled with the memory of the woman's cold fingers on her ankle. Emma glanced over at the baby monitor, watching the soft rise and fall of her son's tiny chest as he slept. For once he was peaceful, his face calm and untroubled. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, to reassure herself that he was safe, but her legs felt too weak, too shaky to move. Mark stirred beside her, sensing her distress even in his sleep. Emma, his voice was groggy, thick with exhaustion. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. The nightmare still clung to her, its icy tendrils wrapping around her mind, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. "It's nothing," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. Just a bad dream," Mark sighed and rolled over, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. He gave it a gentle squeeze, but his eyes remained closed. "Try to get some rest," he murmured, already slipping back into sleep. But there would be no rest for Emma. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the nightmare over and over again. The woman's face haunted her, that twisted smile, those dead eyes. She could still hear the woman's voice echoing in her ears, that low, mocking whisper you can't escape dog. The nightmares continued, night after night, each one more vivid, more terrifying than the last. Every time Emma closed her eyes, she found herself back in that dark corridor, running from the woman with the twisted face. The stench of death grew stronger, the air thicker, and the walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her, trapping her in an endless maze of terror. Each time the woman got closer, each time Emma could feel those icy fingers wrapping around her, pulling her back into the darkness. And each time she woke up screaming, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing with fear. Mark tried to comfort her, but there was little he could do. He was struggling too, though he refused to admit it. The apartment was getting to both of them. The strange sounds, the shifting objects, the oppressive atmosphere, it was all weighing them down, piece by piece. And now, with Emma's nightmares growing more intense, the tension between them was becoming unbearable. "I can't take it anymore," Emma said one morning, her voice trembling with exhaustion. She hadn't slept properly in days, and her eyes were hollow with fear. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." Mark didn't respond right away. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring down at the dark liquid as if it held the answers to their problems. The smell of rot still lingered in the air, though it was fainter now, like a ghost of the foul stench that had haunted them for weeks. "We need to leave," Emma continued, her voice cracking. "This place. It's not right. I feel like I'm trapped here, like I can't breathe. And the nightmares. Mark, they're getting worse." Mark glanced up at her, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt it too, the suffocating dread that had settled over the apartment like a dark cloud, pressing down on them with invisible weight. But leaving wasn't that simple. They didn't have anywhere else to go, and the thought of abandoning the apartment, of leaving behind the little stability they had, terrified him. "I know," he said finally, his voice low. "I know it's hard, but we can't just leave. Where would we go?" Emma shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't care. Anywhere but here. Please, Mark, I can't stay here anymore." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. He could feel the trembling in her fingers, the raw fear that had taken hold of her, and for the first time he realized that they might not have a choice. If they didn't leave soon, this place would destroy them. That night, Emma had the worst nightmare of all. It began like the others, with her standing in the long, dark corridor, the walls closing in around her. But this time the woman was already there, standing just a few feet away, her twisted face illuminated by the flickering light overhead. "You can't escape," the woman whispered, her voice echoing off the walls. Emma tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her body locked in fear as the woman crept closer, her smile widening with every step. "You belong to me now," the woman hissed, her cold breath brushing against Emma's skin. "You'll never leave." Emma's heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's hands reached out, her fingers curling around Emma's throat, squeezing tighter and tighter until Emma woke with a gasp, her hands clutching her neck as though she could still feel the woman's grip. But this time she wasn't in her bed. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the tile floor, her body trembling with fear. The stench of death was stronger than ever, thick and overpowering, and as Emma looked down, she saw the dark stain spreading across the floor once more, slick and wet like fresh blood. Her heart stopped. She wasn't dreaming. The nightmare was real. Part 7. The Cellar Discovery. The night was thick with a suffocating stillness, as if the very air in the apartment held its breath, waiting. Mark couldn't sleep. His body lay tense on the bed, heart thudding heavily in his chest, while his mind spun like a broken record, repeating the same chilling question over and over again: where is it coming from? That smell. The smell of rot, of something long dead, had seeped into their lives like an unstoppable plague. No matter what they did, no matter how many windows they opened, or how many cleaning products they used, the stench clung to the walls, the floors, their very skin. Emma lay beside him, her face drawn and hollow from nights without rest. She had stopped talking about the nightmare, stopped talking at all, really. Fear had taken root in her, and it was spreading, darkening her once bright spirit. Mark felt powerless, watching her slip further away with each passing day, knowing that the longer they stayed in this apartment, the more it was consuming them. But tonight, Mark knew he had to do something. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to find the source of that horrific stench, whatever it was, and rid their home of it for good. His resolve solidified in the dark as he slid quietly out of bed, careful not to wake Emma. The baby, mercifully, was silent for once, fast asleep in his crib across the room. Mark gave one last glance at his family before tiptoeing out into the hallway. The smell hit him as soon as he crossed the threshold. It wasn't as intense in the bedroom, but out here it was palpable, thick and heavy, like a physical presence pressing down on him. It was coming from the floor, Mark was sure of it. Something was hidden beneath them, festering, rotting, and he was going to find it. The cellar. The thought chilled him. He had barely been down there since he had moved in, but the memory of it now tugged at his mind, a dark tank space with creaking beams and cold stone walls. It was the kind of place that seemed to harbor secrets long buried and best forgotten. Mark hesitated, a flicker of doubt dancing in his mind. But no, he had to do this. He had to know what was lurking beneath them. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made his way to the narrow staircase that led down to the cellar. The steps creaked ominously beneath his weight as he descended, and the air grew colder the deeper he went, as if the very temperature of the earth shifted below. The smell grew stronger, more putrid, nearly making him gag. It was as if the foul odor itself was alive, crawling up from the depths to meet him. The cellar was darker than he remembered, the shadows thick and oppressive, like a living thing coiled in every corner. Mark clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness, illuminating the stone walls covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was damp and heavy, filled with a silence so absolute it seemed to ring in his ears. There was no sound except the thud of his own heartbeat and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. He swept the light across the room, his breath coming in shallow, controlled gasps. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, just old storage boxes, rusted tools, and the remnants of some long-forgotten life left behind by whoever had lived here before. But the smell, it was worse down here, almost unbearable now. And it wasn't just coming from the air, it was seeping up from the floor. Mark moved slowly, his feet scuffing across the stone surface, his pulse quickening with each step. The beam of the flashlight flickered as he passed a pile of loose floorboards stacked haphazardly against the far wall. Something about them drew his attention, and a cold shiver crawled down his spine. He crouched down, setting the flashlight on the ground so its beam illuminated the floorboards. His hands trembled as he reached for the nearest one, feeling the dampness of the wood beneath his fingers. He hesitated for a moment, a voice in the back of his mind screaming for him to stop, to turn around and leave this place before it was too late. But he couldn't. The compulsion to find the source of the smell, to uncover the truth, was too strong. With a deep breath, Mark pried the first floorboard loose. The stench hit him full force, a wave of decay that made his stomach churn and his vision blur. He gagged, stumbling back, but forced himself to continue. He tore up another board and another, each one coming up with a groan of protest, as though the earth itself didn't want to reveal what it was hiding. And then he saw it. Beneath the floorboards, lying in the dirt, was the remains of a human skeleton. The bones were tangled in a decaying gown, the fabric brittle and discolored with age. The skull, oh God, the skull was partially crushed, the left side caved in, as if it had been struck by something heavy. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare up at him, accusing, as though the bones themselves held the memory of the violence that had ended the woman's life. Mark staggered back, his mind reeling in horror. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. His heart raced, a drumbeat of panic pounding in his ears as the truth hit him like a freight train. This is her. This is the woman haunting you as thought. The realization settled over him, cold and heavy. This wasn't just some random forgotten skeleton hidden beneath their home. This was the spirit that had been tormenting them, the twisted, malevolent presence that had driven Emma into nightmares and filled their lives with terror. She had been murdered, her skull crushed, her body buried beneath the floorboards like garbage. And now she wanted something? Justice? Revenge? Mark didn't know, but the truth was as clear as the bones at his feet. They were living in a tomb. Suddenly, the temperature in the cellar dropped. The cold was so intense that it cut through Mark's clothes, biting into his skin, making his breath fog in the air. He could feel it, a presence, dark and suffocating, closing in on him, pressing against the walls of the cellar like an unseen force. He grabbed the flashlight, his hand shaking, and backed away from the skeleton. His mind raced, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, to get out of that cellar and never come back. But something held him there, frozen, as though the very air had turned to ice. And then he heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely more than a breath, but it echoed through the cellar, filling the space with its haunting melody. Mark turned slowly, the flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the room, but there was nothing there. No one. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears with its eerie cadence. It was a woman's voice, raspy and cold, like the wind howling through a graveyard at midnight. Mark's skin prickled with fear as the voice filled the room, growing louder and louder until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. He backed away, his feet stumbling over the loose floorboards, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The voice was speaking to him, calling to him, but he couldn't understand the words. It was like a chant, dark and ancient, its meaning lost to him but heavy with menace. Then, without warning, the voice stopped. The cellar fell into a deafening silence, so thick and oppressive that Mark could feel it pressing against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His heart pounded in the stillness, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. And then, slowly, the whisper returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the air around him. It was coming from the skeleton. Mark's flashlight flickered as he stared down at the bones. The skull lay tilted in the dirt, its empty eye sockets glaring up at him, and from the gaping mouth, the whispering voice spilled out, soft and sinister. "Help." Mark stumbled back, his blood running cold. The words were unmistakable this time, as clear as if they had been whispered directly into his ear. The spirit of the woman, this murdered woman, was reaching out to him, pleading with him. But what could he do? What did she want? Terror gripped him, freezing his limbs as the whisper grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," it repeated, the voice echoing his mind, filling every corner of the cellar. Mark turned and ran. He bolted up the stairs, his legs trembling, the flashlight swinging wildly as he sprinted for the door. The voice followed him, whispering, chanting, growing louder with each step. He could feel the cold breath of the spirit on the back of his neck, her presence pushing him forward faster, faster, until he burst through the cellar door and slammed it shut behind him. The house was eerily silent. His breathing was ragged, his body shaking with adrenaline. He pressed his back against the door, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart, but the whispering still echoed in his mind. Help Emmy, Mark knew, with a sinking certainty, that there was no escape from this. Whatever had happened to that woman, whatever had brought her to this gruesome end, it wasn't over. Her spirit was still here, trapped in the decaying bones beneath their home, and now she had found them. They couldn't stay here. Not another night. They had to leave. But as Mark stood there, trembling in the dark hallway, he realized with a sickening dread that leaving might not be enough. The woman's spirit wasn't bound to the cellar, it was bound to them. And until they found a way to set her free, she wasn't going to let them go. Mark stumbled back into the bedroom, his face pale, his breath still shaky. Emma stirred as he entered, blinking groggily in the dim light. "Mark," she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" Mark didn't answer right away. His mind was still racing, trying to process what he had seen, what he had heard. The image of the skeleton, the crushed skull, the decaying gown was burned into his mind. He could still hear the whisper in his ears, soft and chilling. "We need to leave," he said finally, his voice slow and trembling. "We need to leave now." Emma sat up, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Mark looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "There's a body in the cellar," he whispered. "A skeleton? A woman? I think it's her, Emma. The woman in your nightmares. The one haunting us." Emma's blood ran cold. She stared at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What are you saying?" Mark swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I think she was murdered, and now she's trapped here, and she's not going to stop until we help her." The weight of his words settled over them, heavy and oppressive, like a dark cloud that had been hanging over them all along. Emma felt a chill run down her spine, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thick, too cold. They were trapped with the spirit of a murdered woman, and until they uncovered the truth of what had happened to her, they would never be free. Mark reached out and took Emma's hand, his grip firm but trembling. "We have to find a way to help her," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "We have to find out what happened. It's the only way." Emma nodded, her throat tight with fear. The nightmares, the whispering, the stench of death, it all made sense now. And as terrifying as the thought of confronting this vengeful spirit was, the thought of staying in this house, of living with this horror, was far worse. They had no choice. They had to face the truth. And whatever dark secrets this apartment held, they were about to uncover them. Part 8. The Flight. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest as he stumbled back into the dimly lit hallway, his mind still reeling from the horrific discovery in the cellar. His body felt cold, the chilling weight of what he had seen pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Every breath felt like it carried the stench of death from the decaying remains below. He had to get out. They had to get out. There was no time to waste. The urgency to escape gripped him, an almost primal instinct that made his legs move faster than his thoughts could keep up. The image of the skeleton, its crushed skull and tattered gown burned into his mind. The voice, the whisper, still echoed in his ears, "Help me," but he couldn't help her. Not now. Not like this. He burst into the bedroom, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling uncontrollably as they gripped the doorframe. Emma was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor, lost in her own fog of dread. The haunted look on her face was all too familiar. She had been wearing it for days. Her once vibrant eyes now seemed dull, clouded with exhaustion and fear, a reflection of the nightmare that had slowly consumed their lives. Mark's voice was rough, desperate. "We have to leave." Now she looked up at him, startled by the urgency in his voice, but there was no need for an explanation. Emma had been living in terror for weeks, haunted by the same oppressive presence that was now strangling the life out of both of them. She didn't need to ask why they had both known this moment was coming. The creeping dread that had infected their apartment was no longer something they could ignore. Emma blinked, her hands twitching as if unsure what to do next. "Mark, what's wrong? What happened?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile and broken, like she already knew the answer, but didn't want to hear it spoken aloud. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm, but the panic bubbling just beneath the surface was threatening to boil over. "I found something," he stammered, his voice trembling. "In the cellar. There's a body down there, Emma. A skeleton. A woman." She was murdered, her skull was. Crushed. Emma's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at Mark wide-eyed. The silence stretched between them for a moment, thick and oppressive, before she finally whispered, "The woman in my dreams." Mark nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's her. It has to be. She's the one haunting us. I don't know why or how, but we can't stay here. We have to leave, Emma. We have to get out of this place right now." There was no hesitation in Emma's eyes. Whatever strength she had left, whatever small part of her that hadn't been consumed by the fear that had gripped her for so long, flared to life. She didn't argue, didn't question it. The need to escape was overwhelming, and there was no room for doubt. They couldn't stay another second in that apartment, not after everything that had happened, and certainly not after Mark's discovery. Emma jumped up from the bed, her movements sharp and frantic. "Okay," she breathed, her voice shaking. "Let's go. Let's pack up what we can and go. I don't care where we go. I just need to be away from here." Mark nodded in agreement, though his mind was still racing. The shadows in the apartment seemed to press in on them as they moved through the dimly lit rooms, packing their things in hurried, jerky motions. The air felt thicker now, as if the apartment itself was fighting to hold them there, to keep them trapped. The walls seemed to groan with a low, distant hum, and every sound felt magnified, bouncing off the silence like the pulse of something alive. As Mark shoved clothes and essentials into bags, his mind kept flashing back to the woman in the cellar. The way her bones had been carelessly buried beneath the floorboards, the way her skull had been shattered. He couldn't shake the image and ignored at him, clawing at his thoughts. Who had killed her? Why was she haunting them? These questions swirled around him like a dark vortex, but he pushed them aside. None of it mattered now, not in this moment. All that mattered was getting out. The answers could come later, but only if they were far, far away from this place. Emma was moving quickly, tossing baby clothes and supplies into a bag, her hands trembling so much that she fumbled with the zippers. The baby, mercifully still asleep in his crib, remained blissfully unaware of the terror engulfing his parents. Mark shot a glance at the clock. 1:15 a.m., the dead of night. It seemed fitting, somehow, that they would be fleeing in the darkness, as if the very shadows of the apartment had driven them out. As they packed, the apartment seemed to shift around them. The air was colder now, the familiar scent of rot wafting through the rooms more intensely than ever before. It felt as if the apartment was watching them, aware of their every move. The whispers that had haunted them for weeks seemed to linger in the corners of the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Don't leave. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he zipped up the last of their bags. He could feel it, a presence, something dark and malevolent, watching them from the very walls. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman, the ghost, knew what they were doing. She didn't want them to leave. "Hurry," he muttered to Emma, his voice thick with fear. "We need to hurry," Emma nodded, her face pale as she cradled their sleeping baby in her arms. They moved swiftly through the apartment, gathering the last of their belongings, every movement heavy with the weight of dread. Each footstep seemed louder than the last, each breath labored, as if the air itself was trying to choke them. As Mark threw open the front door, a gust of cold air hit them, making Emma shiver. She tightened her grip on the baby, her eyes darting around as if expecting to see the ghostly figure of the woman standing in the hallway, waiting for them. But the hallway was empty, save for the eerie glow of the streetlights filtering through the window at the far end. The two decorative stone dogs outside their door were still in their place, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow watching her, their cold, lifeless eyes tracking her every move. Mark grabbed the bags and ushered Emma out of the apartment, his hand resting protectively on her back as they hurried down the hallway. Every step felt like a race against time, as if they were trying to outrun the very spirit that had plagued them for weeks. The shadows seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in, but they kept moving, determined to get out before the apartment could swallow them whole. The building was deathly silent as they made their way to the elevator. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange, dancing shadows along the walls, and Emma's heart skipped a beat every time she heard a creak or a rustle. The air was thick with tension, so palpable it felt like something was watching them, lurking just out of sight. Mark jabbed the button for the elevator with more force than necessary, his fingers trembling as they waited for the doors to open. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the last few weeks in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The ghost, the whispers, the rotting stench, it all made sense now. The spirit of the murdered woman had been trying to communicate with them, trying to reach out from the darkness, and they had been too blind to see it. Finally, the elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, and Mark and Emma hurried inside, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The doors closed behind them with a metallic clang, sealing them in a claustrophobic space that felt no safer than the apartment they were fleeing from. The elevator hummed as it descended, the sensation of movement doing little to calm their nerves. Mark's hand gripped the strap of the bag tightly, his knuckles white as he stared at the glowing numbers above the door. He could feel Emma trembling beside him, her body tense as she clutched the baby close to her chest. As the elevator reached the ground floor and the door slid open, Mark and Emma stepped out into the lobby, their hearts pounding with the adrenaline of their flight. The air outside felt different, cleaner, freer, but the weight of what they were leaving behind still pressed down on them. Mark led the way out of the building, his eyes scanning the dark street for any sign of movement. The cold night air bit at their skin, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the apartment. Emma followed close behind, her breath coming in quick bursts as she struggled to keep her composure. They didn't stop until they reached their car, parked haphazardly on the street a few blocks away. Mark threw the bags into the back seat, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. Emma slid into the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she strapped the baby into his car seat. Mark slid into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition, his heart pounding as the engine roared to life. The apartment building loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and silent, as if it was watching them leave. Mark slammed his foot on the gas, peeling away from the curb, the tires screeching on the asphalt as they sped away into the night. They didn't look back. As the city lights blurred past them, Mark felt the tension in his chest begin to loosen, the weight of the apartment's oppressive presence lifting ever so slightly. They were free, at least for now. But as they drove through the empty streets, the image of the woman's skeleton flashed in his mind once more. Her crushed skull, her decaying gown, her bones lying forgotten beneath the floorboards. The memory clung to him, refusing to let go, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Somewhere, deep inside, Mark knew this wasn't over. The woman's spirit wasn't bound to the apartment, he was bound to them. And until they found a way to set her free, until they uncovered the truth of her death, she would never let them go. Emma sat in silence beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Mark knew she was thinking the same thing. They had escaped the apartment, but they hadn't escaped the ghost, not yet. The night stretched on, dark and endless, as they drove away from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. But no matter how far they went, the weight of the haunting clung to them like a shadow, a reminder that some ghosts cannot be outrun. And as they disappeared into the night, the whispers followed. Part 9. The Haunting Legacy. The road stretched out before them, winding endlessly into the night, but no distance could erase the lingering terror that clung to Mark and Emma. The escape from the apartment was supposed to bring relief, freedom from the oppressive spirit that had haunted their every waking moment and invaded their dreams. But even as the miles passed, Mark could feel the weight of something following them, creeping into the corners of his mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Beside him, Emma was silent, her face pale in the faint glow of the dashboard lights. She held their baby close, as if shielding him from the invisible force that had entwined itself in their lives. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them was thick with unspoken fear, each breath weighed down by the heavy knowledge that they weren't truly free. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white as the silence grew more suffocating. The road ahead was empty, the street lights flickering in the distance like dying stars, casting long shadows that danced and twisted in the periphery of his vision. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he looked back, he would see her standing there, the woman watching them from the dark, her twisted face etched with a malignant grin. No matter how far they went, she would always be there. The nightmares began again that night, though Mark hadn't slept well in weeks, and his exhaustion weighed heavily on him. When he finally collapsed into bed at the hotel they had found, his body craved sleep, but his mind refused to let go. The moment his eyes closed, the familiar sense of dread seeped in, pulling him down into the suffocating darkness of his dreams. It always began the same way. He was standing in the hallway of the apartment, the one they had left behind, with the air thick and cold, pressing down on him like an invisible hand. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long, the doors to the other apartments shut tight as if warning him to turn back. But no matter how hard he tried, his legs moved on their own, dragging him forward deeper into the shadows. At the end of the hallway she waited. The woman. Her face was a grotesque mask, her skin pale and bloated, her eyes sunken and dark, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile that sent chills racing down Mark's spine. She stood perfectly still, her long hair hanging in damp, matted clumps over her shoulders, the tattered remains of her gown clinging to her skeletal frame. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the corridor, soft but dripping with malice. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to run, to turn around, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, frozen in place as she took a step forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "You thought you could leave, but you can't." The air in the hallway grew colder, freezing, and Mark's breath puffed out in small clouds. He could hear the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence, growing louder with each step until they were all he could hear. She was getting closer. Mark tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, his voice strangled by the sheer terror that gripped him. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers long and bony, tipped with jagged, broken nails. The moment her hand touched his skin, icy cold flooded his body, paralyzing him with fear. "You belong to me now," she hissed, her breath cold against his neck. "You never leave." Mark jerked awake, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing as he gasped for breath. The room was dark, but the feeling of her presence still lingered, as though she had followed him out of the dream, her twisted smile lurking just beyond the shadows. Emma stirred beside him, her face peaceful in sleep, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she was dreaming of the woman too. He could sense it, the darkness that had attached itself to them, feeding off their fear. Days passed, but the sense of dread never left. No matter how far they traveled, no matter how many hotels they stayed in, Mark could still feel the presence of the woman. It wasn't as if she was physically there, standing in the corner of the room or watching them from a distance. It was more subtle than that, like a cold draft that crept through the cracks in the walls, a whisper in the back of his mind that never fully went away. At first Mark tried to rationalize it. It was just trauma, he told himself. The lingering effects of everything they had been through in that cursed apartment. It would fade with time, but as the days turned into weeks, the feeling only grew stronger, more pervasive. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, Mark would hear the faintest of whispers, almost too quiet to be real. It was always the same, "You'll never leave." He wouldn't tell Emma, not wanting to worry her any more than she already was. But he saw it in her eyes, she felt it too. The fear had never left her. The woman had left a mark on them both, one that couldn't be erased so easily. The apartment, now vacant, stood as a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. No one moved in after they left. Word spread whispers of strange happenings, of a ghostly presence that lingered long after the last tenants had fled. Neighbors would claim to hear the faint sounds of footsteps in the dead of night, or see fleeting glimpses of a figure in the windows, a woman dressed in white, her face twisted in pain. The building manager had tried to rent it out, but each time something would happen. Prospective tenants would get a strange feeling the moment they stepped inside, a sense of being watched, of something malevolent lurking just out of sight. One couple had even claimed to hear whispering as they toured the apartment, and they left without looking back. The apartment remained empty. No one dared live there, not anymore. It had become a place of whispers, of shadowy figures seen out of the corner of one's eye. A place where lights flickered for no reason, where cold drafts swept through the rooms despite the windows being shut tight. The ghost of the murdered woman, her spirit restless and vengeful, still wandered those halls, forever trapped in the place of her violent death. Mark's life became a strange blur of sleepless nights and haunted days. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the spirit of the woman wasn't bound to the apartment, but to them. The scent of decay would sometimes creep into the room for no reason, the same foul odor that had filled the apartment, and Mark would feel her presence cold and suffocating. The nightmares continued, relentless, pulling him back into that dark hallway where the woman waited for him. No matter where they were, no matter how far they had traveled, she was always there, her twisted smile haunting his every step. He found himself unable to focus on anything else. His job, his relationships, everything began to crumble under the weight of the haunting. Emma, too, was distant, her once bright spirit now dulled by the relentless fear that had taken root in her soul. Their conversations became shorter, their silences heavier, as if both of them were afraid to acknowledge the truth of what was happening. One night, as they lay in bed, Mark finally spoke the words that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Do you still feel her?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. Emma didn't answer at first, her breath hitched, and for a moment Mark thought she wouldn't respond. But then she nodded, her voice trembling as she spoke. Yes, every night Mark closed his eyes, his heart sinking. They had escaped the apartment, but the woman had come with them. She was in their minds, in their dreams, and no matter how far they ran, she would never let them go. The apartment remained empty for years, a ghostly relic of the past, haunted by the restless spirit of the woman who had died there. Her soul, trapped in a place of violence and betrayal, never found peace. And though Mark and Emma had escaped the physical walls of the apartment, they could never escape her presence. The legacy of that haunting would follow them for the rest of their lives, a shadow that darkened every corner, a whisper that echoed in the quietest moments. The woman's need for revenge would never fade, and she would wait, forever watching, forever watching, forever waiting for someone else to make the mistake of entering her domain. And when they did, she would be there, waiting in the darkness, ready to remind them that some ghosts can never be laid to rest.